Hello, and welcome to the Open Virtual Film Project. This is part 3E of my Unreal Skills for Film series, and covers our first method of importing objects into Unreal, the quickly iterable and less strict scene method. This is how I generally get most of my concept work done on a show, as I do most of my modeling work inside of Blender. I save the asset-based workflows, shown in the next two videos, for things I want to use multiple times, often between sets, as well as the cleanup process before turning over a set to an LED stage or VFX house as needed. In this video, I will be noting which steps are necessary for importing into Unreal Engine, and which are useful to keep you organized, but not required, in case you need to move quickly on something that will be read on later, or the more strict alignment is not necessary. Links for the remainder of the series, as well as deep dive videos on the various tools shown, are in the description. In the tool series, you'll find advanced features for each of the 3D modeling software to Unreal bridges. These tutorials are done in Unreal 4.26. However, they have been tested in 4.27 and 5, and when a difference between engine versions shows up, I will note it in the video. This video also assumes that you have gone through the Blender and Unreal setup videos to install the respective plugins. In the Blender, edit, preferences, add-ons, and search for bridge. I want to quickly make sure my export directory is set up. This is where Blender will stage all of your files, and I tend to keep a UE mirror directory on my hard drive in case I need to go back any number of versions of an import. It will also save a backup of your Blender file upon export. Your particular show might also want you to track these files on a server, so it's useful to know where they are. If you're having hard drive issues in terms of space and do not mind losing the backups, you can delete this folder directory ever so often. With that out of the way, we're going to pop into Blender and get started. As you can see, between videos, I did some work modeling out two versions of crown melding, as well as a small concept scene with vines coming out of one of the doors and grasping onto someone's ankle. There's also a skull floating in the background that we're going to turn into a will-o'-the-wisp. However, we're going to hide that for now and work on it in the complex asset section. If you look in the Whirl outliner, you will see I've organized the various components of my scene into collections. If I were in Maya or Rhino, I would do the same thing with their layers. These allow me to turn on and off the various different groups of geo, as well as lock the editing of certain sections. To lock a collection, click the filter button in the top right hand corner and click to show the arrow, and then you can prevent the selection on a collection by turning on and off the arrow next to its name. New collections can be made with the New Collections button, and things can be drag and dropped between the various different collections. These work very similarly to how levels work in UE, and if you want to add something to a collection, make a selection in the viewport and hit the M key, and you can assign the collection or make a new collection at that time. Also, whichever selection you have selected is where new objects will go if you drop them into the scene. An important note is that if you duplicate an object, the duplicate will be in the same collection as the object that was duplicated. This is different to how Unreal operates. At this point, I'm going to hide everything that I do not want to export using these collections. Once I'm happy with all of my modeling, I want to go through my scene and do a few things to prep for export. I want to start by saving a new copy of my file, or by making copies of my objects in new collections before I do any of this, so I can go back and modify as necessary. In this instance, I created a collection called Prep, which is all of the old geometry, and new collections for the skull, vines, and trim. Again, we're hiding the skull right now. If you're cleaning up a file from another software, I have a deep dive on a bunch of cleanup tools that would be useful to you, linked in the description. With our scene in a good place, we want to fill out the details in our OVFP plugin sidebar. Show that by hitting the N key, coming to the tool section, and this Blender Unreal bridge. This is where we click the BTU set default units in the export import video. And inside of here, we want to fill out some details. So our import type is going to be a scene. Again, we're doing the quick and dirty process. We're going to give this a short description, in this case, trim and vines. Again, making sure not to use any special characters, spaces, or underscores. Then we need to fill out the environment name for this object. If I have Unreal open, I can click the Get Environments from UE button, and it'll populate this dropdown with various different environment names. If it's set to new, I can type in an environment name here, even if that environment already exists inside of Unreal. It's very important that this is the same name as the level inside of Unreal. So I'm going into ML Tutorial V002, so I'm going to fill out the name section as tutorial. And then the last thing to fill out is the artist initials, mine are FC. This just helps track who imported what, in case the show needs to contact you later for any questions about the modeling or getting a higher resolution of anything that you have in your scene. And then our last decision is one to make if we're using Unreal 5 or not, which is the ability to turn on auto-generation of Nanite meshes inside of Unreal 5. If it's ticked on, all of the meshes you export will try to use Nanite. If it's ticked off, they won't. Most of the time, you're going to want to use Nanite ticked on for Unreal 5 to leverage that capability. However, certain objects like plants with card leaves don't do as well with Nanite, so you might occasionally turn it off. In this case, I'm going to turn it on because my scene should be able to use Nanite. After that, I go through and make sure everything is split up into the right number of pieces. If I think something needs to be more parts to make it editable in Unreal, I can use the separate command inside of edit mode. To do that, make a selection inside of object mode, hit the tab to get into edit mode, make a selection inside of edit mode, Control L for select linked object is super useful here, and hit the P key to separate objects. You can separate by selection, material, and loose parts. Now the trim for each of the walls is a separate piece. If I wanted to instead combine these two objects into one, I would make a selection inside of object mode, Hold Control and hit J, and that will join them together. Figuring out the right number of objects in your scene is a skill that takes time to develop. I generally split out each major wall section from the floor and ceiling, and any dressing components that might want to be moved around. In this scene, I separated the crown molding on the various different walls, in case I needed to extend or shorten any of the wall distances, as well as each of the vines are their own separate piece, so I can manipulate them if I need to. As I'm working through pieces, I also want to keep an eye on the pivot points of my objects. With an object selected, the pivot point is the little tiny orange dot that shows up. To make it a bit more obvious, if I come into this filter here, drop down, and turn on the Move widget, now if I select an object, it shows an axis. If my pivot point doesn't make any sense, for instance, this piece of molding, the pivot point is all the way over here at the origin. There's two ways of fixing this. The quick way of doing it is with any number of objects selected in object mode. If I hit F3 and search Origin to Geometry, this will center the pivot on the objects selected. If I had multiple objects, it would center the pivot on each of them. If however you have the time and want a little bit more granularity, you can accurately place pivots on any object by jumping into Edit mode with Tab and making a selection. Choosing what you're selecting is the 1 for vertex, 2 for edge, 3 for face selection. And I can select as many things as I want. And with a selection in the OVFP sidebar, under the cleanup section, there's an origin to selected. Now you see that origin point is now at that point that I had selected. If I had selected multiple objects and clicked origin to selected, it'll average the pivot point to that selection. Oftentimes I'll do this with a face of an object where I'll just select one face and then the pivot point will show up in the center of that face. This is especially useful for doors and similar objects. You can place the point of rotation inside of Unreal exactly where you want it to be. These pivot points will be what shows up in Unreal when you select the object, and while it isn't a necessary step, even the pivot to center of object is a huge quality of life improvement inside of Unreal. You don't want all of your pivot points 500 miles away from you or you're actually working. In addition, things can get a little bit weird with culling if that happens, where objects will disappear randomly. Usually at the same time, I also want to go through and give things logical names if I have the time. Don't worry about our naming conventions yet, it will be taken care of later, but you want to avoid underscores and other special characters. Inside of Blender, things with the same name will get automatically renamed to .001, .002. This is fine, a tool will take care of that later. So for this instance, I grabbed each of the vines and gave them the names vine 01 through vine 05. Again, having a number at the end of objects is super helpful. I can manually rename things by selecting them, hitting F2, or batch rename a group of objects by making a selection, holding down Control, hitting F2, or I can do a find and replace in the name. I could set each of the names to vine, or add a prefix or a suffix, or strip characters. Say if I had a long number at the end and I wanted to strip out all of the numbers at the end of a name, I could do that. So if I hit OK here, you'll see I've got vine.001. Again, this is fine. Also in the OVFP sidebar tool, under the batch renaming tool section, there's a button to open that batch rename tool. There's also a section where you can step through the different objects in your scene to rename them. So if you make a selection and then click the Get Objects, it'll populate a list of your objects, and then I can step through each of them. You see it selects it here. I could rename it here. If I instead don't want to isolate the object and see it in its context, I can untick the isolate button, and then when I click next, it'll jump through each of them. And then once I'm done with any renaming that happens here, say I wanted to rename this to vine.004, I can click either the save name, that'll save the selected name, or save all, and it will save all of the names in this section. If I'm working very quickly and do not have the time to deal with renaming, I will oftentimes do a batch rename all of the meshes in my scene to a short name like OBJ and move on with my life. This prevents a lot of issues later with names getting too long or getting ugly. Once my meshes have logical names, I want to do the same thing with materials and textures in the scene. First thing on this list is to remove any duplicate materials in the scene. If I select everything and click this Remove Duplicate Materials in the OVFP sidebar, I want to do this with the Look Dev mode enabled and go through my scene, make sure that anything did not have a hiccup. If it did have a hiccup, I can undo it and try to find the problem manually. And then once I've removed duplicate materials in my scene, I can remove anything that is not associated with an object by using this cleanup, Remove Unused Objects. This just helps me find objects that are important to my scene, so I don't waste time renaming things that aren't going to show up inside of Unreal. It leaves all of your objects that are in hidden collections alone though. So to rename materials, I can either do it object by selecting an object, coming into its details panel, there's a material section, and renaming the materials here. If this material had any textures associated with it, with the material selected, I could also go through and rename any of the textures here by opening the dropdown and renaming the texture in this field here. Or if I want to see all of the materials in my scene at the same time, I can come over to the scripting panel. On the right hand side, there is an outliner of all of the different types of objects in the scene. Come to the material selection, I can see all of my materials here. Again, I don't care about the naming convention. I'm not going to do the MI tutorial. inside of this material. A script will take care of that for me in a second. However, I do need to pay attention to the naming conventions on my textures. So if I pop it up in my naming convention document and scroll down to the textures, they follow the format of tx underscore package underscore material name underscore freewrite underscore suffix code. So this texture here is skull01 color, and before I move forward, I would need to rename it. So I'm going to rename tx opengameart underscore skull01 underscore col. And as I'm doing this, if the opengameart is not already in my asset source short names document, I would add it here, with any relevant information including the license and a URL if we need be. As I'm working on materials and textures, I want to make a couple of notes. Early on in the process of assigning materials, I can click the Get Materials from UE if I have UE open, and it will create blank materials with the right name for this environment, and I can use those in my scene. If any materials or textures in my Blender file have the same name as their counterparts in the Environment Materials folder, they will auto-link to the UE version, saving you from redoing any setup. So if I were to go through and modify this vines color to be a little bit more green, when this gets imported, it would set up as this color instead of the one that is currently found in Blender. For that reason, I try to keep the number of unique materials in my scene down and give them all very logical names. If I don't have a material planned for an object yet, I will assign something like mi underscore tutorial underscore gray, so that when it comes into Unreal, it has a material assigned to it. Another note is that you can quickly copy materials to lots of meshes in a scene by making a selection inside of Blender and clicking the Control and L keys and link materials. And that will copy over any materials that are in the bright orange object to all of the dark orange objects. Another note is that if I use the standard PBR materials inside of Blender, or the Phong and or blend materials inside of Maya, and do not do any node work, any textures I plug in will be transferred to Unreal. For instance, if I select the skull here, I can add a base color to the skull by clicking this little yellow button here, selecting Image Texture, and then either opening a texture from a file, or clicking this little drop down and selecting the file that's already inside of Blender. And when I import into Unreal, it will auto-link that color texture to the color field of the material that's created. The same thing will happen with various different other nodes inside of this function. It will also select the type of material based on the textures that you have associated with it. So for instance, if you're using an alpha blend material inside of Blender, it will create a glass style material inside of Unreal. Once all of that is done, I can move on to doing the naming conventions for the rest of my assets. Thankfully, this is much easier as I can make a selection of everything. Go into the OVFP toolbar and click the Naming Conventions, Mesh Naming Convention. You'll see it renamed all of my meshes to use the OVFP standard, so I put the sm underscore tutorial underscore at the beginning of all of the names and removed any of the illegal characters that were in those names. So that vine.001 became vine001. And I can do the same thing with the materials by clicking the Material Naming Convention button, where it adds the mi underscore tutorial underscore name of the material. This is a required step and should be done anytime before you export to Unreal, as it takes care of some back-end issues with renaming objects. Once more, I want to step through all of the names of my objects. I can do that with the scripting panel. Objects. Make sure everything looks nice and logical if I've got the time. And we're ready to move on. When you're using the naming convention tool, if the object that you're trying to use a naming convention on already has a proper naming convention, such as this SM OpenGameArt Skull01, it will keep the existing name, which is super useful if you are tracking objects imported from various different websites. The next step is to apply any Blender modifiers that I've been using in the model. The quickest way to do this is to enable a modifier tool plugin under Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, search for modifiers, and tick the box next to modifier tools. With that enabled, I can go through all of my objects, and if they have a modifier associated with them, shown in the modifier section here, I'd be able to click the Apply All button here, and it would apply all of the modifiers. A much quicker way of doing this is selecting everything in the scene, going to the Modifiers section, clicking Apply All, and it will apply all of the modifiers in the scene. Modifiers can cause hiccups when we're exporting to Unreal, so we want to enable all of them. This is the first of the incredibly destructive steps, so again, it is best to save a working copy of this document before you start doing the super destructive things. Once the modifiers are applied, we need to triangulate all the meshes, prevent some issues with n-gons inside of Unreal. When exporting to Unreal, if you have n-gons in your mesh, sometimes things can go a little bit awry. So, with my entire scene selected, if I hit Tab to enter edit mode, select everything again with the A key, and then I can search for triangulate faces, and that solves that problem. In final prep for export, make sure that you have everything in your scene visible. This might involve disabling Isolate View, which is done with the numberpad / key, and unhiding objects. Quickly unhiding everything can be done with Alt-H. Fly through your scene, make sure it looks the way you want it to look or when it's exported into Unreal, and select everything. If you can't select something and you need to, make sure it's not set to unselectable in the World Outliner. And now we're going to go to the OVFP toolbar here, come down to the export section. We'll deal with the no ASH, ASB in the next video. Inside of here, we have the option to export everything for Unreal. However, since we have objects in the scene that we don't want to bring into Unreal, we're instead going to click the export selection for Unreal. If you already have files in that directory, it will ask you to overwrite. If you don't want to overwrite, hit the escape key and it will cancel out of that, and then you can change the name of your import description to get rid of that problem. When we're exporting for Unreal, it includes a date stamp with the export, so you might run into this issue if you're exporting the same file multiple times in a single day. When you export for tracking purposes in that UE mirror directory that I created earlier, it's going to create a folder Game, Environments, Tutorial, Incoming Geo, and then a folder with today's date and the name of your export, saving a backup copy of your blend file, as well as a bunch of information that is used to import the scene into Unreal. And with it exported, I'm going to click the Send Export to Unreal button with Unreal open. And once it's done, inside of Unreal, it will have popped me into the content browser and spawned one of these ASB files out into the scene. In the OVFP naming convention, ASB objects are assembly files and help generate the hierarchy of the scene that you are actively working in. When you are importing, it is often useful to have the scene open and the level you want to add objects active. Doing that, going to the levels browser, selecting the active level that we want by double-clicking, or this pop-up here. However, if you don't, there's an easy fix. If you need to add one of these objects to the scene, drag and drop the ASB into the scene, come to the Details panel, and reset its location. And then if you need to move it between levels, choose the level that you want it to go into. In this case, I'm going to put it in the Kit Bash version 2 level. With the ASB selected, right-click the level, move selected actors to level. Once that is done, come to the Details section of the ASB with the ASB selected. Again, we had zeroed out the location. Shifting around using this ASB will shift the root of the entire scene. Super useful function in case you need to shift things around in your scene. And the first time something comes into Unreal, you want to click this First Run button, and it will spawn out all of the objects and fix the materials in your content browser. After that, anytime you need to add another one of these ASBs into the scene, you can just click the Rebuild Hierarchy and it will do a less destructive process. After you're done with that, make sure to save all, and then you can play around with your scene as much as you want, shifting objects around. You can see that their pivot points are all in the right spots. I could pop objects out of the current hierarchy and attach them to other levels, so if I wanted to A-B between my two different moldings, I could do that by taking this Crown 02 molding and popping it on a Crown 02 sublevel, and the Crown 01 molding, and popping it onto a different sublevel, in the same way we created two sublevels for doors in an earlier video. And for scene imports, if you go to the Content Environments name of your level, in this case Tutorial, Materials folder, this is where all of the materials that you had been working with inside of Blender will have dropped. In part 4 of the series, we'll be talking about how to manipulate these materials. For now, just note that there are material instances, and if you open one of them up, there are lots of sliders and other parameters to play around with. If in Blender you were using roughness, ambient occlusion, or metallic textures, you do need to click this Use ORM texture and untick it, and you'll see it's got that roughness texture associated with it. As of the time of recording this video, I haven't figured out a way of automatically setting or unsetting that checkbox. That's it for this video. Join me in the next one to see how I import a single or group of the Destructor proper assets into Unreal. Thank you for watching. If something goes wrong or I need to manually import one of the ASBs I have created inside of Blender, Maya, or Rhino, if I come into the OVFP plugin, there's an Import-Export field. Inside of here, I could select the FBX that the export generated. So this FBX file path, click the triple dot, come into that UE mirror folder, Game, Environments, Tutorial, Incoming Geo, click the FBX, and then if I try to make paths, this should fill out, and click the Import button. And then I can follow the same process with First Run Rebuild Hierarchy as necessary.